Hey there guys, how's it going? Hope you're all doing well. So I'm going to be starting a new series on this channel called Fantasy Fights. I'm going to be making a separate playlist, and I'm going to be talking about some fantasy fights, some matchups of fights that won't happen for obvious reasons. I mean, these fighters are mostly retired, and many of them will have fought in different eras and whatnot. So obviously these fights have no chance of happening. But these are fights that nonetheless are quite interesting to talk about and theorize how these fights would have gone, and just go back and look at the performances of these fighters and just compare how they would have done against one another. And I'm going to be starting the series by doing Wladimir Klitschko versus Mike Tyson. Now, this is a video I've actually thought about doing for quite a while because this is a matchup that I think is fascinating. I really do. Like, these are two guys that in their era were absolutely number one. Absolutely, they were dominant heavyweight champions. Now, of course, Vladimir fought in a different era. You know, he was after Mike Tyson's time. You know, Mike Tyson was at his peak around about the late 80s, early 90s, and the thing that's very interesting about both of these guys is how they're the complete opposite of one another. And what I mean by that is both of these guys peaked at very different points in their career. For example, Mike Tyson was one of these guys who peaked very early. You know, he hit his prime around about his early 20s. So when he was, say, 19 to 23, that was Tyson at his absolute best. So Tyson from the late 80s towards the early 90s, that was him at his absolute prime. Whereas Wladimir Klitschko, whereas he was a talented fighter in his early 20s, he didn't really hit his peak until later, until say his late 20s, early 30s. I'd say Vladimir from the ages of say 29 to 32, that was him at his absolute peak as far as I'm concerned. And I've watched most of the fights of both of these guys. I've got most of Mike Tyson's career. I've got all sorts of highlights on DVD and whatnot, and I've seen a ton of his fights. I mean, when I was growing up, I used to always watch Mike Tyson fights. You know, any DVD I could get, you know, any footage I could find online. I used to absolutely love watching Mike Tyson. And as far as Vladimir Klitschko goes, well, I grew up with him as my heavyweight champion. You know, he was when I was a kid growing up watching boxing, he was the man. You know, he was number one in the heavyweight division for as long as I could remember. And yeah, I watched a ton of his fights, and I've watched pretty much all his fights. Any fight of Vladimir Klitschko's that there's footage of, I've definitely seen. I've definitely watched. So yeah, let's talk about this. So how do I think this fight would go? This fight for me, and I talked about these guys peaking at different times. So this fight to me would really depend on one thing. It would depend on which version of each fighter we got. Now, let's say it was Mike Tyson from his early 20s versus Vladimir from his early 20s. So let's say it was Tyson from the late 80s, early 90s versus Vladimir from when he was around about a similar age. I think that it's a mismatch. I think that Mike Tyson would break Vladimir Klitschko down, he would tire him out, and he would stop him. He would probably do the same thing to Vladimir that Ross Purity did, only a lot quicker, in my opinion. However, if it was both of these guys at a later age, if it was, say, if it was Tyson from his late 20s versus Vladimir from his late 20s when he started to reach his peak, it's still a mismatch. I think that Vladimir would absolutely demolish Mike Tyson. If it was both of them at their absolute prime, so let's say it was Vladimir from when he was like 31, 32 versus Tyson when he was like 21, 22, for example, who would I favour to win this fight? I would favour Wladimir Klitschko, and I would favour him to do so by knockout, and I'll explain why. Now, obviously, these guys were a contrast of styles. Mike Tyson was a guy who would bob and weave, he would come forward, he would fight small. He was a very short guy for a heavyweight, he was like 5'10", but he had freakish athleticism. Okay, his head movement, his hand speed for a guy of that build, and just the way that he would bob and weave and get underneath the jab of these taller guys and counter them on the inside. He had a wide variety of punches. You know, his uppercuts were lethal. His hooks were lethal, and he was just a fighter who you didn't really want to get on the inside against. You know, if you were going to fight Mike Tyson, you had to be prepared to get down and dirty. You know, if you were going to stand and fight with him. So he was a ferocious fighter, and he was a monster in the ring. A massive puncher, like I said, very fast. Had a big leaping left hook he could knock you out cold with, had a brutal uppercut, like I said, head movement, just a really horrible fighter to deal with on the inside. Wladimir Klitschko, of course, is very different. He's a more of a textbook boxer. He's a guy who's 6'7", very tall, very long arms, and likes to keep you at range and likes to control everything behind the jab. That's the thing about Wladimir Klitschko. He was extremely fundamental, very fundamental indeed. Everything for him was off the jab. However, he was a tremendously big puncher. Let's not get it twisted. I mean, Wladimir Klitschko's jab was like being hit with a right hand. I mean, you'd see him fighting these guys, and as soon as some of these guys would get hit with a jab, that'd be it. They'd be on the outside, completely under control, completely tamed. And it wasn't until very late on in Vladimir's career, like when he was in his late 30s, early 40s, where he started to show a decline in his timing, and his jab wasn't so effective anymore, like you'll see against some of the later guys he fought, like Bryant Jennings, even Povetkin, and of course his two final fights against Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. He wasn't so accurate. His timing on his left hook and on his jab just seemed a little bit off. But Vladimir in his prime, back when he was in his, like I said, late 20s, early 30s, he was insanely accurate. That's one thing you notice about him, is he would just keep you on the outside. He would pepper you with the jab, and he would look to land either a leaping left hook, which was, I think, his best punch. I think without a doubt, the left hook was Vladimir's best punch, or the straight right hand. Those were his two danger shots. He would keep you under control with a jab. He would tame you. He would sort of lull you to sleep with it, and bang, you'd get caught with a left hook, or bang, you'd get caught with a right hand. And if you couldn't avoid Vladimir's jab, the point is, if you couldn't avoid that jab, he'd beat you no matter what. So that was quite interesting to me. And how would that match up with Mike Tyson's style? Well, I said that I would favour Klitschko. And the reason why is because Mike Tyson, in my opinion, had a major flaw. And the major flaw that Mike Tyson had is that he's a classic front runner. Now, Mike Tyson would look great when he was on top, when he was intimidating guys, when he was knocking them down, when he was dominating them. But then when you get a fighter who wasn't intimidated, when you get a fighter like an Evander Holyfield or a Buster Douglas, or somebody who was going to fight fire with fire, who wasn't intimidated or overawed by Mike Tyson's aura, by Mike Tyson's presence, and they could get inside and they could rough him up and kind of beat him at his own game, Mike Tyson didn't like that. Didn't like that at all, and he would fall apart mentally. And I never really saw Mike Tyson as the most mentally strong individual. I know that he has this sort of hard man, badass persona, but Mike Tyson to me was a guy who was somewhat fragile. Like when things weren't going his way in the ring, he would completely lose the plot, and he would do something stupid like bite somebody or hit the ref or do something really daft and just ruin his chances of winning. Like he did that several times in his career. And like I said, guys like Holyfield and Buster Douglas were able to tear him apart inside and take him apart. And of course, later on in Tyson's career, those inconsistencies. I know he was past his prime at this point, but it's still relevant. I mean, he was completely taken apart by the likes of Danny Williams and Kevin McBride and whatnot. So Mike Tyson to me was never the most mentally strong individual, and I think that's a part of the reason why, as he got older, he never really progressed as a fighter. He only really got worse. Whereas Wladimir Klitschko, he has, in my opinion, a reputation that Vladimir had for many years of having a glass chin. Now, he didn't have a great chin, that's true. He didn't take a punch very well, but the reputation that he had about having no heart, because of what happened against Lamont Brewster, Vladimir had a reputation for years as being a sort of a mentally fragile individual. I don't think that narrative was true, if I'm being honest. I don't think that reputation was true. I think that Vladimir Klitschko had a tremendous amount of heart and a tremendous amount of courage. And if you look at any of the fights of Vladimir's career where he got dropped or where he got hurt or when he had to face adversity in the ring, he always bounced back. I mean, when he fought Corey Sanders, he got bounced up and down off the canvas, but he didn't quit in that fight. He kept coming back. And a lot of people would cite the Lemon Brewster fight where he sort of collapsed, but I don't think that was due to like I said, I don't think that was due to a lack of heart. I think that something happened in that fight, something medical. I think there was a medical reason for what happened in that fight. Because let's not forget that he got hospitalized afterwards, and he was winning that fight very easily. He was dominating it, but then towards the end of the fifth round, he just collapsed and started hyperventilating. And there are a lot of theories on what might have happened. I know that Vladimir claimed at the time that he might have been drugged, and do you know what? I wouldn't rule that out. I'm not saying he definitely was drugged, but I wouldn't rule it out. But whatever reason, there could have just been a medical reason there. You know, he might not have been well on the night or something. But he's never done that since, and he's been in a lot more intense and difficult fights since then, and before then. Let's not forget. So I mean, you look at any of Vladimir's fights, like when he fought Samuel Peter, which was a fight he was dominating, but had to expend a lot of energy and got dropped a couple of times from illegal shots. I mean, Sam Peter was hitting him behind the head, hitting him low, very dirty that night. And Vladimir, despite the fact he got dropped unfairly off fouls, he was still coming back and winning the fight, you know, dominating it pretty much, winning it comfortably. So Wladimir Klitschko had a lot of heart to me. I mean, you saw in his last fight against Joshua how tremendously brave he was in that fight. I mean, he's fighting a guy half his age in his backyard and took the fight to him and did a great job. Despite the fact he ended up losing, he managed to drop Anthony Joshua. You know, he got off the canvas himself to do so. So he had a tremendous amount of heart and courage. He was very mentally tough, and that's how, in my opinion, Vladimir was able to come back from the defeats that he had because he was mentally tough and because he was sort of self-aware. He didn't have this aura of invincibility that Mike Tyson had, you know, where he sort of believed in his own nonsense. No, Vladimir had he had a clear vision of his limitations. He understood his limitations as a fighter, and he understood what he could and couldn't do. And he came back very strongly and came back better. Every time he lost, he always came back stronger. So I take that into consideration when I decide who would win out of these two. Now, if Mike Tyson were to get inside on Vladimir, this is another thing. You know, Tyson was used to being able to bully opponents inside and shorten his punches and beat the crap out of them. Wladimir Klitschko, towards his prime, became very astute at sort of taming pressure fighters. And the way he would do it is, of course, he would hold them. You know, he would grab them, he would lean on them. And he also, because Vladimir came from sort of a martial arts background, he also knew how to defend himself inside. He knew where to put his hands. He knew where to position himself and jostle for position and stuff like that. And that's one of the things that was underrated about Vladimir, is he understood, physicalities on the inside. He understood how to manhandle somebody and how to do so, very skillfully, and that's something that I think would have really frustrated Mike Tyson. For example, because if Mike Tyson had got inside and tried to work Vladimir's body, and if Vladimir had just jostled for position inside and maybe leaned on his back or something, Tyson would have probably fallen apart mentally. I mean, when Povetkin got leaned on by Vladimir, you know, he kind of kept his cool. You know, he didn't really lose the plot. But Mike Tyson was a very mentally erratic individual, and I think that if that happened to him, he would probably break down mentally and he'd probably lose the plot. So I don't think that he would be able to break down Vladimir as easy as he would have done a younger Vladimir, you know, when Vladimir was in his early 20s. I think before Vladimir really learned how to hold, you know, before he hired Emmanuel Stewart and whatnot, and learned that Lennox Lewis grab and, jab, jab, grab style. He didn't really learn that style until he signed with Emmanuel Stewart. So I think that Mike Tyson would have had an easier time with the younger Vladimir. But the prime Vladimir, the one who had Emmanuel Stewart as his trainer, I don't think Mike Tyson would have been able to have his way with him inside. And I think that would have caused him problems. Then his only option would have been to try and box him on the outside. And if Tyson tries to fight on the outside and tries to box with Klitschko, it's over. Klitschko would absolutely obliterate him from the outside. He would keep Tyson at bay with the jab, just like he did to any pressure fighter he fought. And he would just hold the center of the ring. He would box his head off, and he would look for a home for that straight right hand or that left hook, and he would probably knock him out, because Mike Tyson was a very heavily muscled individual. He had pretty good stamina, but he wasn't the best at managing his stamina over 12 rounds, and that might, indicate why he was knocked out a bunch of times, and all his defeats, I believe, were by knockout. So that to me would be a problem if he was forced to fight on the outside against Vladimir. Vladimir's jab would just be in his face all night, and even if he's not landing the jab, he would be keeping him at bay with the jab. He would be keeping him busy with the jab because Tyson would constantly have to bob and weave to get away from it, and eventually he might bob and weave into one of those left hooks or bob and weave into one of those right hands. So yeah, I don't think it's a mismatch, but I think I would strongly favour Wladimir Klitschko to beat Mike Tyson by knockout. I think by a late knockout, probably from rounds 8 to 12. Vladimir might have to survive a scare early. He might have a few problems on the inside, but I think that he has the martial arts skills and the sort of the wrestling skills to be able to deal with it. Mike Tyson was never really that great as a martial artist, if you know what I mean. Like when Mike Tyson, you look at some of Mike Tyson's fights, he would get inside against an opponent and he would try and throw some punches. But if his opponents would hold him, what he would often do is he would wait for the referee. He would wait for the referee to just break them up. There were a lot of fights like that earlier in Tyson's career, but against Klitschko that wouldn't have worked because Klitschko would have known what to do inside and known how to tie him up and how to sort of subdue him, how to push him off, how to lean on him and stuff like that. And I think he would have frustrated Mike Tyson. I think he would have negated Mike Tyson's power on the inside. And I think he would have gotten him outside and done the same thing to him that he did to every other pressure fighter, and that's keep him at bay with a jab and knock him out. And I think that Vladimir at his absolute prime versus Tyson at his absolute prime, I think Wladimir Klitschko wins by a knockout. And Tyson has a puncher's chance, no doubt about it. Look, if Mike Tyson were to go in there and just swing an overhand right and catch Vladimir on the chin, he'd probably knock him out. Like I said, Vladimir is somewhat chinny. He didn't have a great chin. Tyson definitely had the superior chin of the two. But I think Vladimir would have been too smart for that. Like, Vladimir was very, very good in the latter part of his career at just taking a little half step back and using his arm, extending his arm to sort of block punches and things like that. And he was very, very good technically and defensively, which Tyson had good defense coming forward, but on the back foot, on the outside, Tyson was pretty useless. So I think that Mike Tyson would get frustrated and I think he would walk onto something, and I think Wladimir Klitschko would knock him out. That's how I see that fight going. So let me know what you guys think anyway. I'm going with Wladimir Klitschko by a knockout from rounds 8 to 12, late knockout. Let me know what you guys think anyway. Thanks for watching, and I've got a few more fantasy fights in mind that I want to talk about. I already had several suggestions, and if you guys have got any more, let me know, and we'll see. We'll see if I can get around to it. So yeah, this is my first in my fantasy fights playlist. Let me know what you guys think anyway. Thanks for watching. Who do you guys think would have won this fight? Thanks for watching. God bless.